Hi, welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you. My name is Jo Aplin, and I teach modern and contemporary art here at Courtauld. I'm also here this evening as director of the Centre for the Art of the Americas, and very, very pleased to welcome Elise Archias, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Illinois, Chicago, to speak to us this evening. I was just reminding Elise we first met many years ago on this occasion of a conference about Bruce Nauman. I think we were probably both finishing our PhDs around that time. And since then, my students, many of them are in the room this evening, past and present, have enjoyed reading Elise's work and thinking alongside her writing, most recently around questions of the body and behaviour in her important book, The Concrete Body, Yvonne Rainer, Carolee Schneemann, Vito Acconci. This was published by Yale in 2016, and anyone who hasn't read this already, I urge you to do so. It proposes a really powerful combination of insightful analysis, historical and social commentary, and offers a really incisive and politically charged argument, and it was rightly the winner of the Frank Jewett Mather Award for Art Criticism. Elise's research and teaching centres around art since 1945 and includes particularly performance art and dance, and it asks questions about the relationship between abstract ideals, physical materials and human needs in 20th and 21st century life and aesthetics. She's co-editor of the Arts Special Issue Dance and Abstraction from 2020 and editor of the special double issue for non-site Contemporary Art and the PMC, and that was in two parts published in 21 and 22, and I think we'll be hearing more about that project this evening, where Elise is going to be speaking about her new project. Her lecture is titled Art and Management, and after the talk, which will be about 50 or so minutes, we'll have time for some questions from the audience, and then we'll just go down the corridor here, a couple of doors, and you're welcome to join us for a glass of wine. But first, let's welcome Elise.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's a real honor to be here with such an accomplished faculty at the Courtauld and their students. So thank you so much for coming out tonight and listening to what I have to say. Yes, this talk tonight is taken from the introduction of the book I'm working on now, which is going to be sort of a concise study of the painter Joan Mitchell and the sculptor Melvin Edwards, and thinking about them in the historical context defined by the rise of the professional managerial class in the mid-century. So you'll be hearing more about the PMC tonight than Mitchell or Edwards, since they're covered in different chapters, but you'll hear a bit about both of them. Right. After the Democratic Party in the United States lost the presidential election earlier this month to a right-wing authoritarian candidate, almost immediately, three sources that I respect provided as explanation for the loss the fact that the Democrats did not have a story that voters earning less than $50,000 per year could connect to and trust. For sociology professor and New York Times columnist Tressie McMillan Cottom, a winning story has to contain a vision of a better life, not just policy proposals. For leftist news show host Crystal Ball, a story requires clearly defining, quote, who the villains are. A story needs an enemy. Journalist David Sirota supported her view by pointing out that unlike Bernie Sanders in 2020, the Harris campaign refused to call out, quote, economic evildoers, whereas Trump has always capitalized on working class resentment. The Democrats' policies and plans included no guarantee that they would stop the people who run the corporations and banks, destroy communities, and make off like bandits, so there was no reason to trust that a better life would result from them. My talk today and the book project it is drawn from are motivated by a desire for a clearer narrative or story in which to situate contemporary art since 1960. Though contemporary art studies are not required to pass the test of an election every few years, I feel confident in saying that my field has suffered some of the same problems as the Democratic Party. It has largely avoided questions about social class in favor of questions about gender, race, and sexuality that can be addressed without challenging or disrupting the structure of an economy that relies on exploiting the majority of adult human beings. So too, like most of the art we study, art historians have avoided characterizing what sort of life or practice we desire in favor of articulating how works of art offer critiques of existing attitudes, values, and power dynamics, and leaving it at that. Though an emphasis on critique is not the same as an emphasis on policy, both approaches usually rely on specialized knowledge and take distance from immediate feelings of pleasure or suffering, features which make them both harder to understand and emotionally connect with. For most of the 20th century, educated professionals, managers, and experts have addressed their spheres of influence in this way, asking to be trusted on the basis of their skill at finding technical solutions to technical problems, rather than their ability and determination to prevail in the agons of capitalism. For decades now, humanities disciplines have been training students in critical deconstructive techniques designed to locate the disadvantaged category in any social relationship, whether or not language-based binaries can be accurately mapped onto the facts and feelings of the situation as it played out in history. As a result, we don't really have a clearly defined sense of who was whose enemy in the 20th century, the way we do when we study the 19th century art of Manet, for example. We might be inclined to think racism, sexism, or homophobia is the enemy, and we do make clear we are against these things, as we should. But these have become abstractions. They can be nouns without bodies, amorphous poisons to be feared and policed by experts like us, and they have by now so often been used as weapons to divide us and deflect attention away from exploitation that they no longer galvanize working people on behalf of liberal agendas. It may be true that postmodern art and theory in the 20th century intentionally destroyed, along with all mythologies, any working notion of what a good or better life is. But I think it would be good for us in the 21st century to allow some distance between ourselves and this position. The only reason most of my grad students are willing to name for valuing a particular artist's work have to do with the effectiveness or cleverness of the critique it stages. I try to get them thinking also about what the work seems to understand about being a human being in a world, or whether it contains something positive we might use or rely on to guide our own work and relationships in private and public with other adults. But it is hard for them. I know that my terms here sound quaint, at best arcane, certainly neither sexy nor new. Who thinks in terms of private and public anymore? How dare I suggest that human beings have anything in common worth dwelling upon? Our rejection of modern notions such as private, public, work, social practice, subjectivity, universal humanity, even art as something distinct from culture, has a history. And the project I'm presenting here today aims A, to remind my audience that the rejection was not unanimous in the mid-20th century, and B, to argue that some of the artists who refused to fully participate in it are still worth attending to and caring about. Preface 2. In the years around 1960, white men in seats of power and influence in the US and Europe confidently abandoned Enlightenment principles, and with them, old modern approaches to activities as varied as understanding oneself, governing states, and making art. Here are 3 examples to illustrate. Jacques Lacan, as early as 1953, pointed to the frustration inherent in the very discourse of the subject. rather than relying, perhaps, on Rousseauian ideas about education and human development as necessarily involving negotiation between cultural ideals on the one hand and the bodily realm of physical particularity, need, and impulse on the other, Lacan redefines the path to health for his postmodern human being as one of recognizing that this being has never been anything more than his construct in the imaginary, and that this construct disappoints all his certitudes. The truth of selfhood is finally found to be dispossession, which is to say one does not have a persistent self, after all, only a changing sight determined by intersecting external vectors. In his 1962 commencement address at Yale University, John F. Kennedy bid farewell to the era in which rival ideologies undergirded by passion had guided statecraft, and instead called for practical management, techniques aimed at keeping a great economic machinery moving ahead. Key to Kennedy's new approach to global power was cultural recognition rather than colonial domination, as he articulated in a 1959 speech describing his fellow Americans' belated realization that Africa, unlike our comic strip stereotypes, is a land of rich diversity of noble and ancient cultures. Kennedy's blithe transcendence during the middle of the Cold War of communism as a rival ideology and his simultaneous embrace of market flows plus cultural diversity should be contrasted with the picture of such policies provided by Kwame Nkrumah in 1965. As part of his efforts to educate the non-aligned movement on the destructive tactics of neocolonialism and achieve economic self-sufficiency for Ghana, Nkrumah wrote, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty, including, of course, a recognizable noble culture." He continues, "In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside, by American oil companies, for example. The result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than for the development of the less developed parts of the world." Finally, in 1965, the National Gallery of Canada in Toronto caused a scandal when he refused to declare a shipment of Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes and Campbell soup can paintings artworks, as required to get them through Canada Customs duty-free. This led to the cancellation of Warhol's exhibition at the museum and a TV interview in which Warhol, rather than defending his work's artistic legitimacy, agreed that his sculpture was not original and that he had just copied a common item. When the reporter asked, "Why have you not bothered to do that? Why not create something new?" Warhol replied, "Because it's easier to do." At the same time that the white man's postmodernism was gaining traction, in the post-war US, more white women and black men were going to art school, making art, and showing it in galleries and other institutions in the professional art world, attended by an educated middle and upper class audience than ever before. Many of them continued to work in a modernist mode, governed by old Enlightenment notions such as form and composition, interior and society, feeling and the individual. As people whose access to public participation in state government and the field of art had only relatively recently expanded, might these white women and black men, and by the 1970s, black and Latino women as well, like Nkrumah, have been interested in lingering a little longer upon rival ideologies? Is it possible the self was for them not experienced as Lacan's intangible disappointment, but as a site of desire and suffering, with very good reasons for constructing and reforming institutions such that human beings' universal capacities and needs would be protected and looked after? Might they not only have welcomed opportunities to demonstrate effort and skill, but considered their particular manner of solving problems and expressing realities to be necessary and broadly beneficial? My aim with these two prefaces is to give some indication of the historical method I'm trying to use in this book. I'm presuming to compare simultaneous shifts in the mid-20th century, proposing we use political and intellectual conflicts to help us think about simultaneous changes in the ways people thought about and made art. In other words, can we see the shift from self to construct, democracy to unfettered market machine, modern art to pop, as alignment along two sides of a divide that defined the next era of history? Contrary to the triumphalist narratives about the American century, the second half of the 20th century was characterized above all by losses for working people in the context of a massive redistribution of wealth upward to the ruling elite, a defining attribute of the neoliberal order that has only continued in the 21st century. Requisite for these losses was a change in ideology among the middle class. If in the 19th century, the middle class in the US consisted mostly of small business owners, farmers, lawyers, and doctors, in the 20th century, with the growth of monopoly capitalism, they became the class of managers and white-collar workers, with the definition of profession expanding dramatically beyond lawyers and doctors to include engineers, social workers, teachers, psychologists, and the many other college-educated experts who directed the working class and the middle class in the right ways to work, parent, and be healthy. This group is who the term professional-managerial class, or PMC, refers to. As most professionals and managers were and are employees of companies and institutions, they are not technically a class distinct from the working class. Nevertheless, I will refer to them throughout this talk as the PMC, not only for convenience, but because in the areas where their values and practices did cohere, they exerted a powerful influence on politics in the 20th century. As the mediators between capital and labor, that is, between the owning, funding few and working, consuming majority, the professionals and managers have always served a specific structural function in the power dynamics of capitalism, and it is the way they performed and understood the politics of this function that changed over the course of the century. The early PMC of the Progressive and New Deal eras had faith in what we might call the technocratic ideal. This historic PMC was committed to using expertise to reform large bureaucratic institutions, whether the state or the company, and relied upon the ideology of professionalism to bolster its members' agency within these institutions. Professional autonomy from capital was promoted not only as a way to preserve a place in the market for their expertise, but also to protect the integrity of their research and to maintain standards in the face of big capital's impulse to favor profits over quality or effectiveness. The technocratic ideal was also an important part of what the early PMC used to morally distinguish themselves from what they judged to be a less principled and more spiritually compromised capitalist bourgeoisie. During the Cold War, however, the liberal democratic ideals and civic responsibility were largely abandoned, allowing those conservatives who had never fully been on board with the modern liberal emphasis on universalizing concepts like rights and institutions like the judiciary to set the tone for middle-class interiority going forward. By the 1950s, white-collar jobs had come to be associated with organization man conformity and alienation, and in the 1960s and 70s, professionals and managers became increasingly disillusioned with the large organizations and institutions that they had energetically sought to reform and protect from capitalist imperatives in the 1920s and 30s. This neo-PMC, let's call them, had shifted from a position that was more antagonistic to and autonomous from the imperatives that issue from the systemic drives of capitalism to one that was more complacent about such imperatives. Thus, as Gary Gersel explains, the political conviction, a historian, the political conviction that most precious That political conviction most precious to the New Deal order, the notion that government power could be wielded effectively to manage the economy in the public interest, gave way in the 1960s to what historian Ira Katz-Nelson describes as a Democratic Party that, quote, embraced interest group pluralism and found itself vulnerable to charges that it was nothing more than a holding company for special interests. The histories of neoliberalism that I've been citing make clear that the dominant narrative on offer since the 1980s in mainstream neoliberal culture about the 60s as a revolutionary decade in which freedoms expanded because institutional regulation was rejected is only half right at best. Scholars such as Thomas Frank have already made efforts to reveal the cracks in this golden bowl story of the baby boomer generation, but few of their insights have managed yet to penetrate art history's account of contemporary art. One such effort in the humanities is Andrew Hoberek's Twilight of the Middle Class, published in 2005, a book that uses literature to track the ways middle-class consciousness in the US emphasized individuality in the face of organization man conformity. For Hoberek, such an emphasis was key to shoring up the PMC's, quote, cultural dominance, even while the middle class was becoming more and more precarious economically. With their fiercely defended individuality, the middle class would be responsible for preserving human creativity and spontaneity in the face of corporate drudgery and unadventurous bureaucratic conformism. Insofar as cultural dominance was pursued, quote, rather than seeking a potentially more useful affiliation with those already outside the magic circle of capital or working class wage earners, cultural dominance can be seen with hindsight, Hoberek argues, as a sort of consolation prize that the neo-PMC of the 60s accepted for giving up the historic PMC's agonistic relationship with big capital. Such a relational orientation, at minimum, would have been necessary to protect the needs and interests of working people, themselves included, in the long run, against the accumulation of wealth at the top of the capitalist economic hierarchy. In the aesthetics of American daily life, PMC cultural dominance looked and felt like managerialism, insofar as managerial theory and practice came to determine the experience of work. This was true for both the PMC and what's been called a new kind of working class worker, predominant really since 1930, quote, the semi-skilled operative, whom employers strenuously tried to acclimate to the hierarchical, bureaucratic character of the modern workplace, as historians Steve Fraser and Gary Ursel again have discussed. Christopher Lasch, writing in 1984, blames the managed workplace for a loss of confidence among most Americans in their own resources and judgment, now displaced by an overriding reliance on experts. Such passivity was also encouraged, he observes, by consumerism's overflowing supply of products to address the socially unacceptable flaws the cultural experts were constantly pointing out in everyone, themselves included. Wendy Brown, in Undoing the Demos from 2015, argues managerialism ultimately informed the predominant understanding of politics in the neoliberal era, contrasting liberal democratic government, a concrete set of activities, with neoliberal governance, an abstract concept. She writes, above all, governance reconceives the political as a field of management or administration, and public life is reduced to problem solving and program implementation. Liberal democratic government, by contrast, at its best, entailed, quote, deliberation about justice and other common goods, contestation over values and purposes, struggles over power, pursuit of visions for the good, for the whole. For Brown, it is crucial that though liberal democracy in the 19th and early 20th centuries was imbricated with capitalism, it nevertheless maintained a, quote, interval between economic and political life. The separation is key. As long as it operated in a different lexical and semiotic register from capital, liberal democratic principles and expectations could be mobilized to limit capitalist productions of value and market distributions. They could be a platform for critiques of those values and distributions, and they could gestate more radical democratic aspirations. In the neoliberal order, Brown observes, this distance collapses as market values become the only values. Whereas Brown offers a sweeping critical overview of what happened to capitalist liberal democracy after 1970, political scientist Adolph Reed provides a case study of what she is talking about in his 1979 article, Black Particularity Reconsidered. Reed views the main problem for political organizing after the civil rights movement to have been the reduction of the Black population to a homogeneous entity without political disagreements, crucially those pertaining to competing class interests. Anticipating Brown, Reed observes that without space in the political movement for, quote, internal conflicts and critical dialogue, the Black power radicals that had gained strength in the movement in the 1960s could not formulate their own political demands with enough coherence to clarity to lead. Hence, they, quote, forfeited hegemony over political programs to the best organized element in the Black community, the administrative elite. Summarizing these insights, Reed writes, Black control was by no means equivalent to democratization. And elsewhere in his work and in the article, he emphasizes that it also did little to further economic redistribution to the working class. So both Reed and Brown emphasize an emerging prohibition against antagonistic relationships in the public space of politics. Part of what I'm trying to explore in this introductory chapter is how contemporary art after 1960 participates in or responds to a context marked by the loss of separation between market values and processes and what was different enough from those processes to negate them. One reason the historical narratives I've been outlining here matter so much in the cases of Joan Mitchell, a white painter born in 1925 in Chicago, and Melvin Edwards, a Black sculptor born in 1937 in Texas, is that each of their careers both spanned and refused the major shift in style that the most influential gallery owners, critics, curators, and artists in the United States embraced in the 1960s. For these tastemakers, pop, minimalism, and conceptual art belonged to and stood for a new historical episode in the US after World War II, and they were eager not to be left behind. Though Mitchell and Edwards were both part of artistic conversations in New York City and benefited from audiences there, they were not interested in the commercial subject matter that gave New York art dealer Ivan Karp, quote, chills the day he realized he, quote, had the foundations of a bona fide new art movement in Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, and James Rosenquist, who all sought representation for their work in the Castelli Gallery around 1960. Mitchell's career circa 1960 rarely brought her to California outside of occasional visits to her sister's home in Santa Barbara, but Edwards, living in Los Angeles from 1955 to 1967, had ample opportunity to take interest in the assemblage and pop art shown at the Ferris Gallery, run by Walter Hopps and Irving Blum. His friend, the artist Ed Burial, worked at Ferris as an installer, and Ron Miyashiro, Edwards' mate in the studio next door, had substantial interactions with Hopps about his sculpture, as Joan Key has discussed in her work. At a public artist conversation held at the Getty Research Institute in 2011, titled Assemblage and Politics, Edward was on stage with a number of artists from the scene, and he distinguished his medium from the, quote, found objects that define assemblage. He said, it wasn't that they were found objects. It was that I was looking for steel and economically finding it where I could or buying it where I could. I would go to scrap yards. I'm never sure that that term that stuck, found objects or junk, and stuff like that, really applied. It was material, and I've stayed consistently and primarily with steel. Edwards further clarified that for him, quote, the process of construction is more important. That is, assembling things is a part or a way or another word perhaps for the idea of constructing things, end quote. Rather than trying to mobilize the particular history that each found object has, as Burial, also a panelist at this event, explained he was trying to do, Edwards understood himself to be pursuing certain ideas in sculptural form, using a resistant but malleable material with multiple qualities and associations. So in addition to pop art's embrace of commodification and assemblage's predilection for the pathos of discarded commodities, Mitchell and Edwards each also declined to adopt the look or logic of industrial containers and fixtures broadly associated with minimal art. Even though collector Robert Scull handed over thousands of dollars in the early 1960s so that Richard Bellamy might show them in a new Soho space called the Green Gallery. Ditto for Edwards for the shiny glass boxes and discs produced by artists in what would eventually be called the Light and Space movement in LA, such as Larry Bell and Robert Irwin, also shown at Ferris. And ditto for Mitchell for the patterns of geometric shapes, stripes, and dots that would eventually be called op art by Time magazine in 1964, or systemic painting by curator Lawrence Alloway in his exhibition at the Guggenheim in 1966. From Alloway's checklist, Ellsworth Kelly and Frank Stella had also been shown in the early 1960s at Ferris. Mitchell and Edwards each manifested the same lack of interest in what later became known as conceptual art, which rejected the traditional media of painting and sculpture and instead presented at first documentation of faraway events, such as Dennis Oppenheim's photographed temporary earthwork in the snow, Annual Rings in 1968 at John Gibson's Little Gallery in New York, or verbal propositions on cardstock wall labels, as seen in Joseph Cassute's first show at Castelli at the end of 1969. Such projects made sense to Edwards, he has said, but as part of an unfortunately unfinished process of sculptural thinking. Reflecting on the conceptual art he saw during his first few years living in New York, starting in 1967, Edwards said, much of it struck me as graduate school projects. Meanwhile, for someone whose body and soul were as committed to the practice of painting and print media as Mitchell's were, conceptual art might just as well have happened on another planet. I've never seen her mention it ever in anything. But if someone knows otherwise, let me know. The artworks made in the late 1960s and 1970s by Black Powerites and some feminists shared not only a more direct political messaging, but also an emphasis on crafting new mythologies based on biological essentialisms. Though these features distinguished them from the irony and abstraction on display in pop, minimalist, and conceptual art, they too constituted an important components of the artistic sea changes of the 60s and should be considered part of the same episode in 20th century US history. The most prominent space where artists who explored and articulated the aesthetics of Black Power first showed their work in New York was the Studio Museum in Harlem, including an exhibition of works by the Afro-Cobra Collective from Chicago, such as one of the works on the left. Then in 1970, the Whitney Museum included works by Barclay Hendricks and Betty Saar, here on the right, among the various figurative, geometric, and minimalist works included in its unfocused survey exhibition, Contemporary Black Artists in America. Feminist art that conveyed the intention in art historian Josephine Withers' words of, quote, claiming their own female bodies as a locus of wisdom and power, such as works made by Judy Chicago and Mary Beth Adelson, was supported for the most part in the early 1970s only by universities and newly formed feminist institutions, such as the Women's Building in Los Angeles and AIR Gallery in New York. Woman House, Chicago's collaboration with Miriam Shapiro and the 21 students in their feminist art program at CalArts, opened in Los Angeles in 1972. Adelson's work was included in AIR Gallery's 1973 Invitational Women Artists from Washington, D.C., one of 14 all-women shows in that year alone. Mitchell was embraced by feminist artists and curators, taking a prominent position, slot number 2 there, of 69, in Adelson's iconic lithograph, Some Living American Women Artists, Last Supper. And she was in an exhibition in 1973 organized in New York at Fairleigh Dickinson University by the Women in the Arts organization. Likewise, Edwards was frequently invited to participate in shows of Black art and African American art that included artists more identified with Black power aesthetics than he was. Nevertheless, it probably goes without saying by now, neither Mitchell nor Edwards seem to have been tempted by the neo-mythologizing identitarian models of Black power and goddess feminism either, as neither ever returned to figuration. Edwards is consistently very diplomatic about such differences from his African American artist colleagues, but there were 2 instances in 1970 alone in which he distanced himself from exhibitions organized under the heading of Black art. In the first, he declined an invitation from the MFA in Boston because he didn't like some of the curator's notions, he said. In the second, he and 6 others withdrew their work from a Whitney show once they realized the curation lacked, quote, in-depth historical research or any regard for our real qualities. As late as 1965, Mitchell flatly denied that a new kind of thing had displaced the, quote, sensibility of the artistic tradition she belonged to. I don't think it displaces it, she said. Referring to op more than pop, she also said, more fun looking out my window than out of dot. In her practice, she later explained, I put down what I think and want the painting to give out to the person, to be clear enough. Later again, she added, the way to do it is relationship, and she repeated, relationship. With similar certainty, Edwards has also explained what he, quote, liked about the title, abstract expressionism, for the mode of experimental making he embraced in the early 1960s, in spite of the growing trend among Black artists in the US to refuse such abstraction due to its ties to European culture. Quote, the whole thing about modern art is, you can invent your own game and all the rules. It's just a matter of, does it come out vital as work? I always felt that the person who said, well, abstract art is not ours, not Black, they were just uninformed. And then in a different context, he said, I didn't see why there couldn't be some language and expression in the modern art world that was honestly about where I came from. Art historian Raphael Rubinstein has designated 1960 as perhaps the last moment when abstract expressionist artists could exhibit with the feeling of being surrounded by a sympathetic art world. Long after 1960, both Mitchell and Edwards continued to make abstract works of art in which the qualities, interactions, and arrangement of unformed materials and textures play an important role in the finished composition. Mitchell lived until 1992 when she died at age 67, and Edwards' practice is ongoing today at age 87. The premise of this book is to consider practices like Mitchell's and Edwards to have greater critical and historical significance than art history has given them so far. If art historians were to stop trying to rescue Mitchell's and Edwards' works by finding postmodern and neoliberal values in them, we might instead see their deployment and adaptation of modernist modes of making as a quietly stubborn critique of and alternative to the dominant tendencies in 20th century contemporary art and the neoliberal anti-modern worldviews this art in many ways heralded and enabled. Let me say a bit more about what I mean by 60s art, and then why I think we should view it as appealing to and helping to define a managerialist period eye, in Michael Baxendall's sense, of an art that flatters the skills that have given a particular class of viewers power in their society's economy. The main change in art after about 1962, what we call contemporary art, is that unlike the best art of the modernists, It stops answering the abstracting processes of capitalism with a dialectic that negates that abstraction. Instead, contemporary art offers a form that prioritizes an idea and usually a system, including eventually the idea of an identity category. For example, Andy Warhol's idea was to make the process of making and beholding art as much like ordinary consumption as possible. Dan Flavin's idea was that art should draw attention to the way context determines meaning. Wadsworth Jarrell's paintings and prints offer different figures to stand for the Black Power movement's idea of the Black hero or heroine, in this case, Angela Davis. In all three of these examples, there's very little in the work to prevent us from grasping the idea in play or the system used to produce it. Each turns to a commercial product, technique, or motif to make the work more familiar and ordinary. Of the three, Jarrell is the most likely to impress us with his skill at the level of handiwork, and he is the only one who seems to offer an interpretation of or feeling about the thing he represents. But when placed next to Mitchell's Searching for a Needle, even Jarrell looks systematic rather than dialectical by comparison. His is an effort of translation, translating the shades of gray in the original photo into a corresponding combination of color, size, and shape. The work of coding is more important than the effort of an individual trying to give utterance to something that was never apparent in quite this way before, nor said in this particular way before, which is how the Mitchell comes across and is intended to come across. She uses both earthy and unnatural colors to offer us an unrecognizable, hovering, sketchy entity that nevertheless occupies space via a kind of structuring armature with interior pockets and hollows. This technique has the effect of forcing us to use our basic bodily concepts such as inside or surface, dense or airy, near or far, to make sense of it, even though it is entirely abstract. Jarrell's work, designed in fact to be eventually mechanically reproduced as a poster, and it was, looks more like the Warhol than the Mitchell. Similarly, comparing Flavin with a sculpture from Edwards' Lynch Fragment series, Afro Phoenix No. 1, from 1963, just 1 year before Flavin's first exhibition at the Green Gallery here on the right, we might be struck by the number of qualitatively different relationships Edwards' work puts on display, as variously sized, shaped, and textured pieces of metal have been made to connect through visible welds. Edwards' work is composed, almost symmetrical, except for a number of singularities in the bottom half, such as the chunk hanging from a short length of chain like a single earring on the left-hand side of this head-sized, abstract, non-face mask. In that accented compositional coherence, we see Edwards' idea, his plan, his intentions, but he has left many examples of what in his metal material made that idea hard to realize or posed obstacles that had to be worked around in the final work for us to see. Flavin's series does not give the sense that anything came between the man and his plan, or ever will. His arrangements of bulbs seem secure, nothing less than expertly engineered, and one can imagine the chosen system will be able to generate variations endlessly. Variation alone, in itself, seems to be the main point of the formal differences on display. Qualitative differences are so small as to be uninteresting. It is true that when the sculptures shine their different tints of white light on different gallery visitors' clothes, say, or glasses, hair, or skin color, nuanced relationships between materials having different qualities might become available for visitors, but these are left to chance, dependent on context or literalized, as Michael Fried would put it, not something to be universally shared from one audience to the next across time. Thus, qualitative experiences, in the end, are privatized in Flavin's work, rather than being rendered meaningful socially and publicly, as they are in Edwards. The tension in Mitchell and Edwards between the compositional plan and what in the materials stands in the way of that plan or must be negotiated with in order to arrive at the form that works, is what sets their art apart from those of their peers that did so much to shape the aesthetics of contemporary art going forward. That said, it's important to acknowledge the way all three of my 60s examples might be said to give form to feelings of alienation, that this might even be what separates them from advertising and makes them art. Angela Davis's resonating words in the Gerald emanate out from her like a psychedelic rock star, but she is also dissolving into her aggregate parts at risk of evaporating in the sun or blowing away in the wind. Gerald seems to suggest the only answer to racialized violence is to flatten and abstract the body, to turn it into words. Poor Flavin might be seen as unable to create, only appropriate. Flavin and Warhol partake in the anti-idealism and the hip sense of humor being sold in the ad campaign for the Volkswagen Bug by the Doyle Dane Bernbach Agency in 1959. But the irony expressed in Warhol's slapdash copy seems undergirded by a depressed acceptance that alienation from visual representation is now what we will consume, and so it feels crucially different from the DDB ad. It's much more out in the open that this ironic awareness of our alienation is all we have to share now, rather than any notion of a good life or practice that we're trying to attain. From the extensive literature on managerialism and the PMC in the 20th century, one learns that characteristics of a managerial social style or approach to the world include, first of all, as Barbara Ehrenreich has explained, a faith going back to the progressive era that all social problems could be transformed into technical problems, and technical problems could only be solved by expanding the new class of professional experts. Such technical solutions rely on what Thomas Klikauer has more recently, in 2015, described as the managerially engineered realm of manufactured facts claiming to speak for themselves. Facts speaking for themselves was, of course, practically a mantra for both Donald Judd and Frank Stella, and a cornerstone of painter Robert Ryman's pragmatic philosophy. Secondly, and related to the emphasis on technical solutions, 60s art is managerialist in the kind of labor it makes available for us to feel and understand. Again, as Ehrenreich explains, the professional or manager is granted far more autonomy than working-class wage earners in his or her work and is expected to be fairly self-directing. Their job is often to define the work of others, to conceptualize and command. Mental and manual work becomes separated in PMC labor, with greater emphasis on the mental side. This insight might make us think of Saul LeWitt's famous proposal from 1967 that in conceptual art, quote, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art, leading to works like 49 three-part variations on 3 different kinds of cubes. Here, LeWitt functions really as both manager and white-collar worker, devising and then obliging himself to exhaust all options in a system of stacks made up of 3 cubic parts, with the identity of each unit determined by whether front side, back side, or both are left either open or closed. Ehrenreich's point about conceptualizing and commanding might also make us think of all the event scores by Fluxus artists such as Yoko Ono and George Brecht, telling their audiences what to do throughout the early 60s in terse typed memos. 60s art can often convey a feeling that the work is endless or will require tireless effort to maintain. There are few incidents of repose or grace, no ground, no place to stop and take stock in Yayoi Kusama's late abstract expressionist field of dots on mustard yellow, for example. Even when the 60s artist returns to recognizable imagery, as in Warhol's flavored Marilyn series, Monroe's bubbly, vulnerable sensuality is only referred to, touched on hurriedly, as if there is no time to delay, as if it were simply a frictionless transactional idea. This feeling of a system that must be maintained at the expense of pleasure or comfort fits with Ehrenreich's account of one of the most concrete vulnerabilities of the PMC. Though they direct others, they also have to work constantly, spending years on education and professional development to gain and maintain access to their professional positions. And such access is not inheritable. It cannot be passed down to their children, who must be prepared for the disciplinary rigors their lives will require, adding another layer of anxious labor to the PMC's parenting and child-rearing. We could certainly read Kusama and Lewitt as offering, like Warhol, a symptomatic critical performance of the alienating conditions that surround them in the 20th century, overwhelming repetition, or the absurdity of unmotivated busy work, or what David Graeber would call a bullshit job. Yet I would argue such knowing critical readings also in the end affirm mental labor. Getting the point with whatever accompanying feelings of wry resignation is what allows the viewer to take her distance from any suffering being commented upon. It stands in for whatever sensuous presence or earnest construction we recognize to have been lost. Knowing you are alienated becomes a protective banner of PMC privilege. Additionally, the PMC's position between capital and labor, we learn from the literature, requires them to be disinterested politically, devoid of political convictions, never taking a side. As the keepers of harmony in the workplace, they are expected to maintain a controlled affect, especially anger should be controlled. We learn from Carol and Peter Stearns that this was key to a whole theory of anger written up in American managerial manuals in the 1930s and 40s as part of an anger control campaign going back to the 1920s. This theory posits that a worker's anger should never be seen as a reasonable reaction to workplace conditions or relations, but the result of personal limitations, likely stemming from home life or childhood. Pop and minimalism provide the clearest illustration of PMC feeling control, with their shared emphasis on the surface and denial or emptying out of the interior, or what used to stand for interiority. Such values were stated explicitly, as when Warhol writes things like pop comes from the outside, or Donald Judd insists only what can be seen there is there, or when Roy Lichtenstein touts anti-sensibility over purposeful nuance. As one of its methods for sealing out difficult feelings, managerialism cultivates, quote, the propensity to figure out new categorizations based on vague notions of either cultural background or personality type. This, according to another one of its critics, the historian Elizabeth Lash Quinn. Especially, she writes, quote, as civil rights prompted long overdue integration in many workplaces in the 1960s and 70s, managerial theory has relied on identity categories in its approach to human relations, tending to exclude factors that might cut across culture, race, and gender, such as, quote, genuine conflicts of interest. Reducing individuals to the accepted general characteristics of the culture or identity group to which they are seen to belong functions to compartmentalize and personalize whatever negative emotions they bring to the job. No problem is really anybody's fault. It's either a personal, private emotion or merely a clash between different cultures, easily ironed out and managed if the manager simply listens calmly and with sympathy, or brings in a diversity training expert so everyone understands how to be sensitive to everyone else's categories, a practice that started in the 1970s. In art, this managerial reliance on abstract identity categories, the managerial correlate to political interest groups, we could say, often translates to a sign for what may be a real conflict or site of suffering in the world, instead of a representation of struggle that convinces you its maker understands what struggle feels like. We are often presented with abstract heroes and villains, a reduction of a human reality into something that is either all good or all bad. Judy Chicago here illustrates a critique, loud and clear, but I would not say she engages with a problem in which she understands herself to be implicated. For Klikauer, Managerial technocracy deprives society of its very basis. It has rendered obsolete any qualitative change which would establish different institutions supporting a new direction. Such a view takes as a given that social relations are fundamentally based in their qualitative material aspects and observes the technocratic approach to human relations behaving as though the qualitative dimension does not exist or does not matter. It is there to be sorted into categories and managed, not felt and be transformed by, or to have one's plan transformed by. Art that stays rooted in a pre-60s modern model like Mitchell's or Edwards convinces you that its maker understands what struggle feels like qualitatively. It expects you to recognize when a process of coming to terms gets something right and when it doesn't. It expects your judgment, and it hopes for that judgment to provide a basis for solidarity, because you will only get the work by coming to terms with its form yourself. Drawing on Ehrenreich's formulation cited earlier, mental and manual work are not separated, and this is key to how the artwork convinces us to trust it as a model of practice. Mitchell's and Edwards' respective herbs both, in other words, explore relationship in aesthetic form with an understanding of its metaphorical significance as a mode through which people think together about unifying public social forms. Mitchell and Edwards each worked with and believed in older aesthetic notions from the history of art that, as Howard Singerman has demonstrated, thousands of art students who received modernist art educations in the first half of the 20th century also embraced. These included not only the priority on compositional coherence and a dialectic between abstraction and concrete physical experience, but also the idea that art has its basis in a human subject that negotiates between interior and exterior determinations. The categories one's culture supplies to name social groups are external. How one lives with and against those categories based on convictions, beliefs, needs, and values experienced, yes, internally, is the stuff of social practice. The formal principles modern artists used were understood to adhere to modern values, namely to a universal understanding of what all human beings are capable of and struggle to achieve, and which served as the basis for the Enlightenment notion of justice, that in turn served as the basis for the theory of socialism as a model of government. Mitchell and Edwards continued to work with these principles circa 1960 and long after as a white woman and a black man, two who benefited, as I stated at the start, from relatively recent normalization of the idea that individuals belonging to their particular demographics were even entitled to participate in politics by voting or to make art that would be considered representative of their chapter of history. The argument I'm putting forward then is this. Mitchell and Edwards refuse the undialectical abstractions of 60s art and keep making dialectical concrete abstractions, or what in the end we might simply call art. To continue to make art in the face of the managerial systems dominating the workplace and art in the late 20th century was to offer a critical alternative to the miserable compromise the PMC made to secure their place in the neoliberal hierarchy, i.e., having the power to shape a culture so long as it was subservient to market logics. Serious modern art had always, for the most part, insisted or taken it as a given that art as a practice was fundamentally different from and opposed to the process of commodification, a process which not only fails to meet the human need for meaningfully unifying social forms, but dominates on a mass scale by convincing people that such a need does not exist, and that only the most immediate needs, easily gratifiable in isolation with a purchased product, matter. Though today it is hard to imagine how Mitchell and Edwards might have stood for or modeled a mode of working and thinking that was viable for the middle-class majority after 1965 to adopt, adapt, and carry forward, I am proposing we at least ask ourselves, if not like their artworks, what a viable, dialectical, embodied but abstract concretization of the ideas and understandings we hold to be the most true, unifying, or otherwise worthwhile, what such a form would look and feel like to us today. That's it.